You're probably here because of an ugly meter, probably got some paint chipping, some rust, but you can make it brand spanking new like mine following my steps. Citing sold separately. But best of all is that my process works for rusted gas meters and pipes as well. In the business, we call that a twofer. This ain't no HGTV, I'm going to show you the good, the bad, and you guessed it, the ugly. But first, let's get back to the basics because most people don't realize that 4/8 of all homeowners have an ugly electrical meter, and 6/5 of everyone watching doesn't understand fractions. And while I'm firmly in both camps with an ugly meter that's rusty, it's crusty, it's dusty, it's peeling, it has me reeling, and since I'm tired of rhyming, it was time to fix it. Now, I was initially playing the half-ass it by just spraying some spray paint on it, but I got on the Google machine and added my inquiry, led me to believe that I should do it correctly. But then it called me a beatnik, which was mildly offensive and fairly confusing. Then I found out these targeted sites are crazy as it was specifically talking to me, even going so far as to make fun of my nose, calling it a sundial every time I lay down. So after a full 17.93 seconds of emotional abuse, I got up out of my chair, headed back to the house, and decided that I could indeed full-ass it. And after nodding for a solid 2 minutes at my meter concerning all of my neighbors, the first step was to remove any extemporaneous wires. Now in my hand is a grounding wire for the internet, but if you're not sure, ask a pro so you don't connect it directly to God's Wi-Fi. It's also important to make as many dad noises while muttering obscenities as possible. I'm going to pause here for the full effect.
Pearl.
Okay, or whatever that was. It's also important to give up often and early, and since I'm a major weenie, I called it quits at this point. Nah, I'm just kidding. I grabbed more firepower. I thought it'd be wise to cut the thickest part of the metal, but then realized that's the dumbest plan ever and cut the thinnest part, and it went much quicker. Now that my meter was barren, I taped up the glass as to not get any of the future paint, primer, or tears of frustration, joy, on the glass. And you're going to want to really press it on. If your meter doesn't file an HR violation, you didn't do it right. Now the glass is protected, I also taped up the tag, which you can't remove. Now let your companies use it to ensure you're not tampering and getting some free Zeus juice. Literally against the law to remove, go directly to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200. Now my next step was wrong because I tried to immediately wire reel the paint, and while it kind of worked, it was really less effective than you after lunch. But I had an idea. Sometimes in life the simplest answer is often the best. So I grabbed what was a $5 scraper, also called the poor man's chisel, by literally no one since I just made that up, so don't say that to anyone, they won't know what we're talking about. And I immediately proceeded blasting my eyes with paint chips. And since they don't sell eyeballs at the hardware store, I got my glasses and proceeded to make the best ASMR that $5 could buy. But it's 2023 and nobody's got time for that, so here is me scraping all the different components of it, including this bar that was the bane of my existence for a solid 4 to 5 minutes. And it's just really important to get every nook and cranny. Now you might also want to put down a tarp. These paint chips are not good for kids or dogs, and while you can eat them, I personally don't, because I prefer the lead-based variety. But once I couldn't scrape no more, it was time for the big guns, and we're going to start to strip. But get your mind out of the gutter, I'm talking about paint stripper. Now I did anticipate this step, and so earlier I stopped at McDonald's and got a water cup for rather nefarious reasons. Unbeknownst to the fast food staffers, I was going to redesign the water cup for my own personal paint stripper palette. And you can pretty much use any small container. Gloves are recommended. Now the paint stripper I chose wasn't necessarily the best, but it was citrus flavored, which I found interesting. It smelled really nice. And unlike the paint chips, this one actually does taste rather citrusy. Nah, I'm just messing. But their watermelon flavor does slap, as the young kids like to say. I then channeled my inner Bob Ross, RIP, and over the next 20 minutes you could see the paint start to bubble, allowing me to scrape with relative ease, and it was honestly kind of one of the more satisfying steps. And once I got most of it off, I could start to wire wheel finally. Now, your girl is also wrong, size does matter, so have an extender bit on hand to get all the nooks and crannies in there that are hard to get. Meters have some odd curvatures, similar to your mother, but it's important to get as much of it off as humanly possible. Now, this step took a couple of rinse and repeats, but on my final pass, the heavens opened up and started to rain on my parade. So naturally, I retreated into my vehicle to eat and ponder the 3 most common comments that I see on my social media profiles. The first one being that I sound like Moist Critical, aka Charlie, aka Penguin Zero, whatever it is. He's a really funny dude. I get this comment so much, I don't see it personally. 2 is that I look like Jim from The Office. I get this one quite a bit. Previously, I also don't see this as well. And 3, I look like Jimmy Garoppolo. And this third one might sound like a humble brag, but I honestly can't see any of those 3 comparisons being accurate. But luckily, pondering my existential identity crisis gave me a chance to eat and also stop at McDonald's again to grab another water cup. Now, electrical meters aside, a really important life lesson is that when you're doing something as nefarious as stealing free water cups from McDonald's that they're willing to give to you, it's really important to have non-shifty eyes like I did. But they didn't suspect a thing and catch on to my grift, and I was out of there making a clean getaway, just in time for me to get back as the rain had stopped, and you guessed it, I was going to re-engineer that cup rather aggressively, because since the paint was now chipped and stripped and wire wheel ipped, come back to me on that one. It was time to remove as much rust as possible. Now, Naval Jelly is a fan favorite, but my local store had this on hand, which was kind of cool because you could see it working almost immediately, turning the metal this whitish foam colored. And I let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, and once it was done working its magic, I then used the wire wheel again to really grind off any of that rust, being extra careful around that dainty wires on that tag. And once I removed as much rust as possible, I have to wash all the jelly off with some good old-fashioned water, or for my northeastern viewers, water. So I grabbed a bucket and the closest piece of cloth that I could find, and the point is to really try to get all the rust remover off because then your paint's not going to stick. Now I'm using a bucket of cloth and a piece of water. You can also spray it with a garden hose, just don't use a pressure washer. These things are waterproof, but if you're shooting 2300 psi's in there, you're not going to have a good time. And once it was all nice and wet, you want to be generous with it, get it nice and soaking. You're going to want to find the nearest piece of cloth and really dry it out as well. Because this next step, you're going to want it dry as a bone. Now, the method that I used, I don't necessarily always recommend it because it doesn't really feel good to wear afterwards, what with all the wetness and the metal shavings and the chemicals on your skin. But it is an option if you really have a tough time finding anything else. Now, the next step, you're going to need a primer. And that metal has to be primed with etching primer in my very own opinion. Now this uses an acid to eat into the metal and create a really strong bond, similar to the bond felt between you and your dad before he walked out 20 years ago to get a pack of cigarettes. Now prepping is important as to not get it everywhere, but since I'm literally reciting the entire house later, I gave up trying to impress a bunch of strangers on the internet and blasted the meter and subsequently the sighting behind it. But usually what you do is you put some cardboard back there, you get some painter's tape, paint everything up all nice and pretty, so that when you're spraying, you're not going to hit your beloved siding and your gutters and all that good stuff. And while we did channel our inner Bob Ross earlier, RIP, we're going to go ahead and channel our inner Banksy right now. And you're going to want to spray in light passes. You're going to want to basically take your finger off the nozzle after you go past the box, not stopping on it. And you're going to want to flick your wrist at the very end. That gives you the best consistency, at least what I found myself. Now, I did have a tiny bit of overspray at one point, and it's like my great-grandmother once taught me. If you ever use etching primer and it starts to drip, correct it before it dries, or else it's going to suck. Or it was something like that. I can't recall since I made it up. Now I gave it a couple coats of primer and then let it dry and hit it with some actual color afterwards. And it's important that you keep it gray since I think it's a requirement. I'm not really sure, but I really wasn't trying to give the government any reason to make me redo this later. I mean, you buy a house, a piece of land, but then they tell you what to do with it and then force you to pay property taxes, which is essentially rent. Do you really ever own it? Well, if you're my local city officials, you do own it and there's nothing wrong and the taxes are actually too low. But I digress because while I was babbling right now, we have ourselves a beautiful box. Previously, I had so much paint and rust that I didn't even notice it said Milbank. But as I was reading, the sun started shining through the clouds. And it was at that moment I knew Mr. Milbank was looking down from the heavens, smiling and thanking me for restoring his beloved electrical meter. This one's for you, Mr. Milbanks. This one's for you.